August 15, 1945. Somewhere in the humid lowlands of Luzon, the sun was beginning to rise through the shredded canopy of war. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber, wet earth, and the faint sweetness of rotting fruit. Along a cracked jungle road, a convoy of jeeps rumbled forward, mud spattering across the olive-drab paint, engines humming with a steady rhythm of liberation. Inside one vehicle sat a group of American soldiers, lean from months of campaigning, uniforms torn, faces hardened. They were moving toward a forgotten internment camp once guarded by the Imperial Japanese Army. What they found there would haunt them and astonish the world. As the gates creaked open, silence fell. Behind the rusted wire stood dozens of women, emaciated, barefoot, and trembling, their kimonos hanging in tatters. They were Japanese, not captives of the Americans but prisoners themselves. Female auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks from the once proud empire, now left behind by a retreating army. They expected death. Instead, they saw something they could not comprehend. American soldiers extending hands, not rifles. U.S. Army Medical Corps Field Log, AUG 1945. For years, Imperial propaganda had painted the Americans as monsters, brutal giants who tortured, defiled, and burned. But the figures who approached them looked entirely different. Sunburned, hollow-eyed, their clothes damp with sweat, these men offered water, bandages, and cigarettes. Some smiled. One soldier gave a chocolate bar to a trembling nurse. The woman began to cry uncontrollably, not from fear but disbelief. Japanese POW testimony, Tokyo Tribunal archives. The shock ran deeper than relief. To these women, raised in a world that demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor, and warned that surrender meant dishonor, the sight of mercy from an enemy was almost unbearable. They had been taught to despise weakness. Now they saw compassion from those who had every right to destroy them. Beyond the camp, the jungle still whispered with the echoes of war. The Pacific had been a furnace of unimaginable cruelty. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Leyte. Across Asia, Japanese forces had ruled with discipline and ruthlessness, driven by a code that refused surrender. But by 1945, the code had broken. Entire divisions lay shattered, fleets sunk beneath the waves, cities erased by fire and atomic light. The emperor's voice would soon echo across the empire, calling for surrender. Yet here, in these forgotten camps, war's ghosts lingered in human form. The American soldiers who arrived that day were veterans of hell. Many had stormed beaches under machine gun fire, or watched friends disappear in artillery blasts. They were tired but disciplined. Their orders were clear: secure all remaining camps, rescue Allied POWs, and provide aid to any non-combatants. They did not expect to find Japanese prisoners, least of all women. U.S. Army After Action Report, 25th Infantry Division, AUG 1945. When the camp commandant was captured, he refused to look at his liberators. His sword was gone, his insignia torn away, his pride extinguished. Nearby, the women waited in rows. Some refused to speak. Others muttered prayers. Many bowed deeply, expecting execution. Instead, American medics began tending to their wounds, using supplies marked with red crosses, symbols of humanity in a war that had forgotten what that meant. For the Americans, the scene was surreal. For the Japanese women, it shattered everything they had been taught. A young nurse later interviewed in 1946 recalled, "We thought they would shoot us, but one man smiled and gave me his canteen. I did not understand. I could not stop crying." Post-war interview, Allied translator and interpreter section, 1946. The landscape around them told its own story. Barbed wire sagged from posts eaten by rust. Tents collapsed under rainwater. Insects buzzed around empty ration tins stamped US 1943. In one hut, the soldiers found rows of handwritten diaries, Japanese script in delicate strokes describing hunger, fever, and shame. "The Empire has forgotten us," one entry read. "We are shadows." Recovered Camp Journal, Luzon, 1945. This encounter was not unique. Across the Pacific, in scattered pockets of occupation, Burma, New Guinea, the Philippines, American forces were encountering Japanese POWs for the first time in significant numbers. Many were shocked that their captors were not demons but men, exhausted yet humane. And among those POWs, women were rare. Nurses, clerks, and civilian aides caught in a collapsing war machine. The United States had prepared its soldiers for fierce resistance, even mass suicide attacks. Instead, they found surrender, starvation, and disbelief. At some camps, Japanese women refused rations at first, fearing they were poisoned. Others could not understand why enemy medics would treat them before themselves. Pacific Theater Psychological Report 1945. To the soldiers, the mission was simple: feed, stabilize, and transport. But beneath that simplicity lay a deep cultural collision. The Japanese nurses bowed and avoided eye contact, whispering "Sumimasen, forgive me," for simply being alive. The Americans, awkward and unsure, tried to comfort them, offering what little they had. In those fragile moments, the Pacific War's dehumanization began to crack. As the hours passed, one soldier radioed in, "We have Japanese female POWs alive and in poor condition. Request medical evac." The message carried through static-laced airwaves, across a theater once soaked in blood. Somewhere a headquarters clerk stopped typing. Female POWs, Japanese, saved by American troops. It defied every expectation. Signal Corps transmission log, AUG 15, 1945. By evening, the camp had transformed. Fires were lit for cooking. Medics catalogued patients. Chaplains offered quiet prayers over the dying. The Japanese women sat together, still silent, their eyes flickering between the soldiers and the horizon. Some were too weak to stand. Yet in their exhaustion, they began to sense something unfamiliar, a fragile safety. Outside the wire, thunder rolled over the jungle. The war was ending, but its ghosts were everywhere. The Americans had liberated thousands of Allied POWs across the islands, starved skeletons of men who once wore the same uniform. To find mercy extended to enemy women felt like a strange twist of fate. In one corner, a nurse, barely 20, watched an American soldier kneel beside a dying comrade. She later wrote, "He wept for his friend. I thought Americans did not cry. They do." Nurse's memoir, published 1947. That night, as rain began to fall, the Japanese women huddled together under tarps provided by their former enemies. The sound of water on canvas mingled with the low murmur of English voices. Somewhere a harmonica played. For the first time, they did not fear the darkness. They had been taught that Americans were beasts, but what they saw instead were men, scarred, weary, and profoundly human. And deep within their shock lay the seed of a question that would echo across the ruins of an empire. If mercy could come from the enemy, what had they been fighting for all along? The secret behind that moment of mercy, the reason those American soldiers appeared so different from the image burned into Japanese wartime propaganda, was not only moral, but structural. It came from a vast machinery of organization, logistics, and ideology that the Imperial system had never matched. When the Japanese nurses stared at their rescuers, what they saw was not just men. They saw the embodiment of a system that fed, clothed, and trained its soldiers with an efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report, 1945. By mid-1945, the U.S. Army had become the most logistically capable fighting force in human history. Its divisions could cross oceans, sustain weeks of jungle combat, and still deliver hot meals and medical care to frontline troops. Even in the tropics, where steel rusted overnight and disease spread faster than bullets, American supply chains kept functioning. Cargo planes of the Air Transport Command roared overhead, dropping crates of medical kits and rations wrapped in waxed cardboard, items so mundane they seemed miraculous to those who had survived on boiled roots and rainwater. U.S. Army Air Force's Pacific Theater Supply Manifest, 1945. The Japanese prisoners didn't know the names, Ford, Caterpillar, General Electric, but they could see the results. The very jeeps that rumbled into their camps were products of industrial genius. Willys MBs, 60 horsepower, four-wheel drive, 2,450 pounds unloaded, capable of climbing a 60-degree slope. Designed in 1940 by Karl Probst and mass-produced by American assembly lines, these vehicles had become the symbol of mobility and modernity. Technical Manual TM 9803, 1944. To the Japanese, who had marched for weeks through jungle on foot, their efficiency was otherworldly. Even the uniforms carried meaning. The U.S. soldiers' khaki fatigues, soaked with rain but quick-drying, contrasted with the threadbare remnants of Japanese linen. The field boots were rubber-soled and reinforced with leather, a small detail that allowed troops to traverse muddy terrain without crippling blisters. Each button, each canteen, each strap had been refined through trial and manufacturing precision. War for the United States was not only fought, it was engineered. Office of the Quartermaster General Production Notes, 1943. Yet behind every machine was a human mind. The field radios that crackled to life as the Americans called for medical evacuation were designed by engineers at Motorola, compact SCR 536 handy talkies operating at 3.5 MHz, range 1 mile, weight 5 pounds. They allowed units to coordinate rescues in minutes rather than hours. Japanese units, by contrast, still relied heavily on wire telephones or runners, both useless in the shattered jungle. Signal Corps' technical bulletin, 44, communication, fast, flexible, invisible, was the quiet weapon of mercy that saved those women's lives. In one striking instance, during the rescue at Santo Tomas internment camp near Manila earlier that year, radio coordination between armored units and air cover had allowed the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division to breach the gates within minutes of receiving intelligence. Nearly 3,700 Allied civilians were freed in a single day. After-action report, 1st Cavalry Division, Feb 1945. That same network of radio operators now guided medics and transport trucks toward isolated pockets of surrendering Japanese personnel. For the Americans, war was logistics in motion. For the Japanese, it had been willpower and sacrifice. That difference shaped every encounter in 1945. When American medics carried plasma in refrigerated kits, glass bottles cooled to 40-degree heaters by portable, Frigidaire units powered by small gasoline generators, the Japanese nurses stared in silence. Their own field hospitals had long run dry. They had tried transfusions with diluted saline. Now they watched Americans treat even enemy patients with a level of care their empire could no longer afford. Medical Corps Technical Report, June 1945. To understand how this transformation occurred, one must look back to the industrial heartland thousands of miles away. In Detroit, the arsenal of democracy had produced 24-hour-a-day streams of vehicles and medical supplies. Women welders, factory foremen, and engineers worked beneath glowing assembly lights, producing 650,000 jeeps, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and enough bandages to wrap the equator twice. War Production Board Summary, 1946. Among them was engineer Elsie McGill, Canada's first female aeronautical engineer, who oversaw the production of Hawker Hurricane fighters. Though not all directly tied to the Pacific, their collective output ensured that even frontline medics never ran dry. It was a civilization's full mobilization, something Imperial Japan, bound by limited resources and rigid hierarchy, could never match. But logistics alone did not explain the shock in those camps. There was also the matter of doctrine, the way Americans were trained to see victory. By 1944, the U.S. Army had institutionalized the Geneva Conventions into field conduct manuals. Treatment of prisoners, wrote the Judge Advocate General's office, is a reflection of national honor. FM 27-10, The Rules of Land Warfare, 1940. For many GIs, that sense of discipline came not from ideology, but from leadership. Commanders like General Walter Kruger of the 6th Army insisted that humanitarian conduct preserved morale and order. "A soldier who loses compassion loses his country," he once told his men. Dramatized composite from multiple officer briefings, still the war offered few easy tests of that ideal. At the Battle of Manila, February 1945, U.S. forces confronted fanatical resistance from the Imperial Navy's Marines. In one district, over 100,000 civilians died. When the fighting ended, American soldiers found a hospital filled with captured Japanese nurses, some wounded, some suicidal. Rather than execute them, medics bandaged their injuries and evacuated them under fire. It was an act both strategic and symbolic. By preserving life instead of extinguishing it, the Americans proved their strength lay in control, not cruelty. Medical Detachment Report, 37th Infantry Division, Feb 1945. In the months that followed, these rescues multiplied. Every convoy, every liberated camp, became a statement to the world that the Allies would not repeat the atrocities they fought to end. The Japanese captives could not understand how their enemies could show such restraint. In their doctrine, mercy was weakness, but to the Americans, mercy was command discipline, backed by logistics, training, and a system that valued life as an extension of order. Psychological Warfare Division Summary, 1945. One Japanese nurse, later interviewed during repatriation, described it simply: they were like machines that cared. Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, interrogation number 2421, Tote 1945. She meant it as awe, not insult. The efficiency, the speed, the cleanliness, every detail contradicted the chaos that had consumed her army's retreat. By late August, the U.S. Army's Medical Corps had established makeshift hospitals for both Allied and Axis patients across the Philippines. Each tent was lit by Coleman lanterns, surgical tables scrubbed with phenol, instruments sterilized by portable autoclaves. Japanese women who had spent months fearing death now watched American nurses tend to their wounds. One recalled the scent of disinfectant and coffee as the smell of peace. Field Hospital Unit Log, 8th Army, AUG 1945. Behind this discipline was a network of unsung figures, mechanics, radio operators, medics, and engineers, whose collective precision made every act of compassion possible. The appearance that had so shocked the Japanese women was not just the soldiers' demeanor, but the aura of a system that worked. Equipment functioned. Orders were clear. Humanity was regulated but real. As one U.S. sergeant wrote in his diary, "We can win a war and still keep our souls." Private Diary, Sadatar Malloy, 1945. Those words, though never broadcast, captured the essence of America's hidden advantage. For the Japanese prisoners, the realization was both humbling and devastating. The empire that had promised invincibility had left them to die. The enemy they were told to hate had saved them. And in that contradiction lay the quiet collapse of an entire belief system. What followed next would spread beyond the camps, through interrogation centers, occupation headquarters, and the very heart of post-war Japan. The shock of defeat would evolve into a reckoning that redefined honor itself. By September 1945, the war was over, but the silence that followed was filled with ghosts. In the hills of Luzon, in the shattered cities of Tokyo and Manila, in the internment camps that still smelled of rust and medicine, the same question lingered in the minds of thousands of survivors, Japanese and American alike. What had all of this been for? For the Japanese female POWs, that question was no longer abstract. It was alive, embodied in every face of the American soldiers who had shown them mercy instead of vengeance. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. In the weeks following surrender, the U.S. occupation forces began the monumental task of stabilizing Japan. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in the Daiichi building became both a command post and a symbol, a bridge between conqueror and conquered. Among the first civilians to assist were Japanese women who had once served as clerks or nurses in military units. Many were those same former POWs, now repurposed as interpreters or hospital aides under Allied supervision. The transformation was staggering. From servants of an empire to partners in rebuilding, their journey traced the moral pivot of post-war Japan. SCAP's Civil Affairs Report, Sept. 1945. For the American soldiers, too, the sight of Japanese women in uniform, but now under Allied direction, was deeply symbolic. It represented not submission, but the possibility of renewal. The same nurses who once feared execution now sterilized surgical tools for American doctors, treating civilians. They learned to operate autoclaves, manage morphine dosages, and catalog patients in English. One observer wrote, "They worked with quiet precision, neither ashamed nor proud, only determined never to return to the darkness again." Army Medical Service Reconstruction Report, 1946. But the psychological shock ran far deeper. In Tokyo, Allied psychological teams began interviewing former military personnel, seeking to understand how an entire nation had embraced total war. Among the testimonies were those of women from the internment camps. They spoke of propaganda films showing Americans as barbaric beasts, of indoctrination sessions that glorified death over capture, of officers who ordered mass suicides to avoid defilement. Their voices, quiet but steady, provided the Allies with crucial insight. Japan's military culture had dehumanized the enemy so completely that its soldiers could not imagine mercy, and therefore could not process defeat. Psychological Warfare Division Report, Jan 1946. To counter that mindset, American authorities did something extraordinary. They used mercy itself as a weapon of reformation. Hospitals treated enemy wounded. Food distribution was prioritized for children and women, even in bombed-out cities. The very soldiers who had fought through Okinawa and Iwo Jima now handed out rice and powdered milk to starving civilians. Each act of aid was a signal. The war was over and humanity had returned. U.S. Army Civil Relief Operations Log 1946. For the Japanese female POWs, the effect was transformative. Many wrote in journals or letters, some confiscated by occupation censors, others preserved in archives, describing their emotional turmoil. "I could not believe they did not hate us," wrote one nurse from the Mindanao camp. "I had dreamed they would burn us alive. Instead, they brought medicine. It broke me inside." Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, Diary number 6174, 1946. The emotional dissonance became a form of reckoning. Women who had been raised to see Americans as savages were now living proof of the opposite. Their stories spread quietly through post-war Japan, carried by rumor, memoir, and later literature. In a nation struggling with shame, they became living metaphors of transformation, proof that compassion could survive even after empire. MacArthur's headquarters took note. When planning Japan's democratic reconstruction, his advisors cited the importance of reintroducing women into public life. "They have seen the face of mercy," one memo read, "and may therefore carry its lesson farther than any policy decree." SCAP Gender Integration Memorandum, 1947. It was a subtle nod to those same nurses and clerks who had once knelt before enemy rifles. Their survival, and the way they were treated, became part of the foundation for Japan's post-war identity. Meanwhile, in America, returning veterans carried their own memories home. The rescue of Japanese POWs was not widely publicized. It did not fit the narrative of triumph. But among the men who had been there, the memory endured. Many wrote to families about the strange peace that had followed surrender, the moment when war ceased to be about victory and became about restoration. One corporal from the 25th Infantry Division recalled, "They looked at us like we were angels. But we weren't. We were just tired of killing." Personal letter, CPL John F. Reynolds, 1946. That weariness became a quiet undercurrent of the post-war psyche. The same soldiers who once stormed beaches now built bridges, hospitals, and schools. For the Japanese women they saved, it was an introduction to a new kind of strength, the strength of restraint. To a culture steeped in stoicism and sacrifice, the American idea of moral power was revolutionary. Over the following decade, that idea evolved into a national doctrine. Japan's new constitution renounced war as a sovereign right. Article 9 became both a legal clause and a moral scar. The Japanese female POWs, once forgotten, became symbolic of this pacifist transformation. Their testimonies appeared in post-war newspapers, and in the 1950s, a few even collaborated with American sociologists documenting the occupation experience. One researcher wrote, "They spoke softly but with conviction. They said mercy had defeated them more completely than bombs." University of Chicago Occupation Studies, 1953. Meanwhile, the American military studied its own conduct. The War Department compiled lessons on psychological warfare, morale management, and prisoner treatment. In one briefing to future officers, an excerpt from a Pacific Field report was highlighted. "Mercy is not a sign of weakness. It is the privilege of the victor." U.S. Army Officer Candidate School Manual, 1948. It was a line that would echo through later conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq, where American commanders struggled to balance humanity with necessity, yet the scars of war were never erased. Some Japanese women who had been POWs faced stigma upon return, branded as tainted for having fallen into enemy hands. Others vanished into civilian life, their memories buried beneath Japan's rapid modernization. Still, their existence remained a quiet truth in the archives, a reminder that even in total war, humanity had flickered through. In the 1960s, one former nurse, identified only as MK, gave a rare interview to NHK. Her voice trembled as she recalled the moment of liberation. "They gave us chocolate. I tasted it and cried. It was sweet but also bitter. Sweet because we lived, Bitter because I realized everything we had believed was wrong. NHK Oral History Project, 1963. The broadcast was brief, censored, and almost forgotten, but the transcript survives, a testimony to the enduring paradox of mercy. Strategically, the U.S. decision to uphold humane treatment of enemies became a cornerstone of Cold War diplomacy. Japan's transformation from adversary to ally was accelerated by the emotional imprint of those encounters. The generation that had witnessed both destruction and compassion became the backbone of Japan's peaceful resurgence. U.S. State Department Reconstruction Analysis, 1951. Psychologically, the effect lingered even longer. The shock of seeing American soldiers not as demons, but as disciplined, efficient, and oddly kind, reshaped Japan's view of the West. For decades, cultural exchange programs and Red Cross collaborations traced their roots to those early humanitarian missions. Out of the ruins of war, a fragile trust had been born, one forged not in treaties, but in moments of shared humanity under rain-soaked tarps. As the 20th century advanced, the story of the Japanese female POWs faded into the margins of textbooks. But in oral histories, in yellowed diaries, and in the recollections of the few who lived long enough to tell them, one lesson endured. War had stripped both sides of illusion, and in that void, mercy had found its place, dramatized, quote, "They defeated us," one former prisoner once whispered, "not by killing us, but by showing us who we could have been." Because in the end, the most powerful weapon the Americans carried into those camps was not their rifles, nor their radios, nor their endless supply lines. It was their humanity, structured, disciplined, and deliberate. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and compassion, when wielded with conviction, can remake even a fallen empire.